Hey everyone, it's Elise and welcome back to my channel where I like to talk about all things personal finance. And as someone who studies personal finance, I argue that being wealthy is simple. But I am also self-aware to know that simple doesn't always mean easy. If simple meant easy, a lot of us would have lost the 20 pounds we've been trying to lose forever at this point. There are just things that we know we ought to do, but for intrinsic reasons, mainly like just life gets in the way, they don't always happen, even though we know what to do to get to that point that we are trying to meet as a goal. I also argue that being young is a cheat code to wealth. Now, as a retired healthcare professional, still licensed, but I'm retired, in school, we learned disease states and health states. And a part of that process was learning the risk factors that led to a certain disease state, as well as the risk factors that led to being healthy. So an example of being healthy is that you're supposed to eat a whole food diet, low in salt, low in sugar, high in fiber. You're supposed to make sure you get a good amount of sleep. You're supposed to drink a lot of water. You're supposed to make sure you exercise, specifically out in the sun, or take vitamin D supplements. You will tend to be healthier. Now, in disease states, there are certain risk factors. An example would be diabetes. Risk factors for type 1 diabetes, you tend to be young, you tend to be white, you tend to be skinny. Not all cases, but those are risk factors that you are at higher risk for getting that disease. Type 2 diabetes is you tend to be of minority status, you tend to have a higher waist circumference, you tend to eat diets in high sugar and high fat, and you tend to not exercise. Those are risk factors. I argue that wealth is the same way. Wealth has risk factors. And this is the first video of 5 videos I'm gonna do in a series about the risk factors, not the risk factors, but the cheat codes or risk factors that lead you to wealth. And the first one is that being young is indeed a cheat code to being wealthy. Now, in this series, I'm starting with the least controversial topic to the most controversial topic. And make sure you stay until the end of this video, which I will talk about what next video's topic will be. But yeah, it does get a little bit more salacious as we go, but I'm starting out with youth because I think most people can logically see how, yeah, if you are more aware about personal finances in your teens and your 20s, you have a higher chance of being wealthy in your 40s, 50s, and 60s. The first reason that youth is a cheat code to wealth that I want to talk about is that you need less money to start in order to end up in millionaire or wealth status. And for context purposes, I'm going to look at my notes to talk about like how much $1 will get you depending on how you start and how early you start. So for every $1 invested, looking at my iPad right now, for every $1 invested, if you start at 20, every dollar that you invest, it really means $88 when you're 65 years or older. When you start at 25, if you start investing, every dollar you invest at 25 is really $44. And let's say you start a little bit later in your 30s, for every dollar that you invest, it turns into, it's really $23. 35, it's really $12 and not $1. And at 40, every dollar that you invest is really $7. People who are younger tend to have lower wages because either you're working a minimum wage job or you're just starting out your career and your salary is not there yet. You're at a starting salary between $30,000 to $45,000, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That is a normal procedure. However, I think people think in their mind they're not making money. But if they are aware that their dollar goes further, everybody has $5 to spare in their 20s. Argue with someone else about that. $5 easily goes to Uber. It easily goes to gambling because that's a big thing now. We all have $5 at any age that is not being used wisely that we could invest it in something else. And in your 20s, it compounds so much if you know that you have that power. And a lot of us don't know that we have that power in our 20s, sadly, because they don't teach us that in grade school. And that's probably done on purpose. To further prove my point, I'm gonna give examples of 3 people who started in their 20s. The first one is Mark Cuban, billionaire. The second one is Brian Preston, multimillionaire. I'm supposing, but I think that's a good supposition. And number 3 is me. not even half a millionaire, but I did start in my 20s, and I'm putting myself in there for context purposes. So I'll start with Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban started in his 20s. He moved to Dallas from wherever he was from because he had a friend that suggested that he come down here because there was a lot of opportunity. His friend let him stay in an apartment with him, and in his 20s, he made the sacrifice of living with 5 other people, not having his own room, and staying in the living room, either on the floor or on the couch, because he was okay with taking the risk and doing something new because there was perceived opportunity there. Another thing that I found striking that he did is that in his daytime job, whatever he was working over there in Dallas, Texas, he had a side hustle. And there was one day where he didn't open the store or something to that extent, or he didn't do something that he was supposed to be doing for his first job because his side job had him tied up, and he wanted to make a sale on his side job that would have afforded him a lot of money, right? His boss, of course, didn't like that because his boss is paying him to do something for his job, and his boss fired him. But for him, he was okay with taking the opportunity risk to making his household, which he was a household of one, better off and not somebody else's household. Him being fired evidently and consequently led him to making his own business, which he ended up selling a few years later, probably in his 30s, because it was a multi-million-dollar business. And that's evidence of starting in your 30s is key because he had time. Let's say all of that failed, but by the time he was in his 40s, he had time to do it all over again. The second person, Brian Preston, is a good example because his life was changed in high school. So this is even before his 20s. He had an economics teacher that shared with him that you could be a millionaire if you saved $100 a month at a very young age. That lit a fire in his mind to explore more and to learn more. He later on went to college, became a CPA, and started an accounting firm on his own in his 20s. I believe it was his late 20s. But the point is, he started a career of his own, specifically in the finance department. But leaving your job that is ripe with benefits and stability to do your own thing is risky. But he had the financial education behind it to take a risk on himself. Now, fast forward to today, he has so many aspects of wealth in his, I don't think he's quite 50 yet, but I remember watching him. If you're interested in him, he is half of the Money Guy team, but he is the actual owner of the company, the originator. And I found him on YouTube, and I found him very helpful in kind of edifying the things that I'm supposed to know about financial literacy. Regardless, though, I remember when his YouTube channel was less than 100,000 people. To this day, it's almost at 600,000. He wrote a book, as well as he bought a commercial real estate in the pandemic when things were really cheap, all because he was ready. And he did this in his 40s because he started literally in high school. I put myself in the mix because I started investing at 27 with the first vessel for investment for me was a 401k. 27 to me is late, but after college, I had another 4 years of schooling that put me into a lot of debt. I put myself in there to say that even if you're in your late 20s, it can be a beneficial thing to start in your late 20s if you can't do it in your beginning 20s. Now, fast forward, I'm in my late 30s, and that 401k is well into 6 figures, as well as I have started another vessel that I'm hoping to get to 6 figures, all because once you start with the financial education of yourself, it only cascades into other things that you'll be surprised that happen, but it's kind of almost inevitable. I also quit my job in my mid-30s a few years ago because I could take the risk. Because of the things I did in my 20s, I'm able to weather the storms that I have. And if I didn't start in my 20s, then I would start my 401ks in my 30s, so I wouldn't be able to quit my job until my 40s. The whole point is the youth that I had on my side and how the other examples had on their side is what propels you into being able to say you're wealthy later on in life. The second reason why youth is a cheat code to wealth is because our bodies are in the best physical shape to trade labor for money. So honestly, in our 20s, we should be working a day job and a side job, or we should be having 2 jobs, or we should be working overtime at the one job that we have. And I say that because our bodies in our 20s are physically able to absorb that additional stress, because it is stress that we're adding to our bodies, if it's mental or physical. working more hours is going to put more on your bodies, but our bodies are able to handle it, particularly in our 20s. So if you are young and you're watching this video, please use this time wisely in this particular decade so that you can find yourself a little bit ahead. Even if you're working 40 plus hours in 1 or 2 jobs, use that time and that money to prepare yourself so you can slow down in your 30s. Because that's what I did when I was working. I was like, I know I'm working hard, I can particularly handle it. And honestly, it was easy. Like, I wasn't as stressed. But I did find out in my 30s, I was like, I can't do this much longer the way that I have been doing it. And use that opportunity to either increase your investments or decrease your debt. When I was working in my 20s, that's when I took my time to decrease the $150,000 that I had in student loan debt, because I knew that that debt was keeping me away from wealth. The number 3 reason why being young is a cheat code to wealth is that failure is not catastrophic, as well as mistakes are not too expensive. In your 20s, it's actually better if you fail and you make mistakes versus if you did it in your 40s and your 50s, and even so in your 30s, because more than likely when you're in your 20s, you don't have anybody else that you're particularly responsible for. You probably don't have children, and you probably do not have a spouse. So any mistakes that you make are all on you. They're not on anybody else. Nobody likes to make mistakes, but in your 20s, whatever mistakes you can make, that you do make, you more than likely can recover from them by the time you're in your 30s or your 40s. And failing also helps you to know what worked and particularly what didn't work. And all of that information is what we generally know as experience. And the more experienced you are, which is why they ask you on those dreaded applications, like, what's your experience? They ask for that because if you have experience, it saves time. And when you have experience, you increase your efficiency. And when you have increased efficiency, you have increased profits. So in your 20s or in your teens, you are in a particular successful position to get to wealth because you need less money to start. You have the physical capacity in your body to do the work that's entailed to get wealthy. And you also have the option to fail and not fail as catastrophically as you would in your later life. And knowing that, at least for me, when I caught wind of how I could be wealthy when I was in my 20s, it made the journey so much easier because I knew I didn't have to kill myself. I knew I had to be a little bit more focused, but no part of the process required me killing myself and overextending myself. It just required me to know the facts and work accordingly. Next week, I'll be talking about how being born into wealth is indeed a cheat factor for wealth. But until then, please let me know in the comments if you started young. Particularly tell me like, oh, I'm 25, I'm 31, I'm 22, and I'm starting to get my financial life in order. And if you see it as a benefit, and if you're happy that you have indeed caught wind that being young is a cheat code. And also let me know if you particularly disagree and you think that age doesn't have a factor. If you like this video, please give it a like so that it can reach other people who are interested in personal finance. And if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe so we continue to grow this community about building finances, getting to our coins, and like learning from each other and seeing each other win. Talk to you guys later. See you next week.